My goodness.
Very glad to have Senator Kassebaum with us today for the 77th Landon Lecture. I believe we'll go till, is it 5 minutes to?
Yeah, 10 o'clock.
10? Okay, we can go till 10 o'clock. And would you like to open with a statement, or would you like to respond to questions?
Well, I might just say it's a real pleasure to be here. One of the guidelines of the Landon Lecture Series was that no Kansan would be invited to be a lecturer. When Senator Dole became Majority Leader, it was felt, of course, that that was a wonderful opportunity to have a Kansan. And I guess this time when President Reagan couldn't come and they were looking for a lecturer, they felt it would be an appropriate time for me to come. And with some reluctance, I felt that indeed it would be fun to do one on Dad's 100th birthday. I remember coming to the first lecture 20 years ago and have been to many since, and it's been a wonderful series. And in many ways, I really think it has added a great deal to Dad's life. I think it has helped keep him active and interested and involved and over the past 20 years, and has meant a great deal to him as well. Saying that, I'll respond to any questions.
Not that we don't enjoy having you here, of course we do. But before we get into the heavy stuff, could I ask you about, did KU really get so cheeky about Reagan coming here that they put so much pressure on that he didn't come at all?
That he just decided to go halfway?
Yeah.
No. That's just what they say at K-State. Yeah. No, it was just that it really worked out for him to be flying home or back to Washington from California. It was easy to stop in Topeka on the way, and they just didn't feel there was time to do a lecture, for one thing. And I believe he's going tomorrow to meet the Pope, I think, in Florida. Was my understanding earlier, whether is that still on the schedule. So I think they felt it just wasn't going to be.
What kind of week has this been for you on your father's 100th birthday? You were home with the governor last week and with the president coming in town and the Landon lecture today. What kind of week has this been for you?
Well, I've really been home all of the August recess, and so the last week has been a little hectic. It's not easy having the president come for a 45-minute visit, and a lot of requirements on the part of the White House and the Secret Service and so forth. So we were rather relieved once it was over, but it was a nice visit, and Dad rose to the occasion. I guess all politicians are performers to a certain extent, and once the curtain goes up, you really are, the adrenaline flows, and it just was nice. He enjoyed it, and everybody enjoyed it.
Senator, I'm just curious, or could you explain how K-State ended up with a series named after the father when he was a KU grad?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not really sure. I think the idea first came from Dr. Boyer, who was here as a political science professor, and President McCain. Do you know, Dr. Reagan? I think that...
The initial idea went to KU, interestingly enough, and nothing was done for about a year, and McCain, I understand, heard about it. Someone else can correct me on this. And called your father and...
Picked up on... I like to leave out that part. So I know that it got... No, that's all right. It got started here, and I think what's made it unique, because other universities have tried it since, of course, and some have even programs that go back further than that, but has been the support of the patrons, which in the early years provided a framework of support that was always there, and that's grown considerably. They always used to be in the field house, Ahern. And I think in the early days they let out classes, which of course was always a big draw. And that's changed. And I think that actually the facility is probably better at McCain Auditorium now. But there were some very interesting lectures in the earlier years, and consistently, I think, has been a series that has drawn very well.
Senator, you mentioned the recess being over. You're going back, I think, today to Washington. Senator Dole has described this coming session as more political and perhaps less productive. How would you describe what's coming up?
The same way. And it's unfortunate because there's going to be some, well, there will be some controversial items on the agenda in September that we can't avoid. One being the Bork nomination to the Supreme Court, the whole question of Nicaragua, I would guess in some form will be before us in September or October, and the budget, which we'll lump together in a continuing resolution with all of its contentious parts, and probably what we'll do is a budget rather similar to last year's, but with smoke and mirrors to sort of frame it in a different way. And we'll put off, as we've tended to do, the hard decisions for a future date. But I think that certainly 88 presidential politics is going to be very much a factor from now on until the election's over.
Could
How
I
much
ask?
time do you think we have before we get into a real economic bind with our finances?
Well, even the experts can't agree. I believe that actually we'll not see any significant change through 88 unless there is some crisis that should develop that one can't really see now. The Federal Reserve having raised the discount rate and the prime rate having responded by, of course, going up, indicates that the Fed at this juncture has decided to be very tough on inflation. I think they were probably wise in taking that action now rather than later. It will be then out of the way before the heat of the presidential campaign will really start up. And a lot depends, I think, on whether the Persian Gulf could really erupt or the Middle East. But basically, my guess is that we will continue on in sort of a slow, steady growth. The deficit's going to haunt us, and I think that, again, we're putting off what is really a very crucial issue for us, and I address it in my talk this morning as being one of the two extremely important challenges before us, because we are basically financing our operations today by foreign investment. And by that I mean investment of bonds and assets in this country. And that's not healthy. It has not hurt us up to this point, but I think that we can't put off recognizing the importance of that trend and that development.
Senator, what's your assessment of the two peace plans for Central America and their effectiveness, if any?
I think the Arias plan, I think both plans leave something to be desired, but any initiative is going to call for compromises along the way. I think the Arias plan is very important and significant because it was agreed to and supported by all 5 presidents in Central America. And that in and of itself is significant. I hope that we will have the patience and perseverance to help nurture that process. It's not without its flaws that I think will and can be corrected as it moves along, particularly in calling for the removal of the Soviet military support. But I think that it's very important that we be supportive of the Arias plan at this point. It's not going to be easy. And I think, again, there's some who would like to see the question of Nicaragua be a debate in the presidential campaign in '88.
you talk about presidential campaign having a big effect on politics upcoming months, year. If you were approached about being involved in a presidential ticket, what would be your reaction?
No,
No, no interest whatsoever?
that's right.
Any particular reason?
Well, after watching what it takes to get the president in town for 45 minutes, you know, we've made life very difficult for those who would serve as president or vice president. I think too difficult. And a campaign, it's just more a question of endurance than perhaps any real reflective debate. I have seen commentators who say that perhaps that's good. If you can survive 2 years of a presidential campaign, it shows that you can survive the running of the country. Well, I don't know. You know, there's some of us who remember when presidential campaigns didn't start till after Labor Day of the election year, and I wish it could still be that way. Obviously, we can't turn the clock back, but I think that personally, it's not bringing out the best in our system in the way that we're functioning today.
Do you have any favorites for the Republican Party nomination? Anyone that you see at this point?
I'm a Kansas co-chairman for Bob Dole.
How do you think his chances are?
I think they look very good. I think he is developing momentum in the right time and in the right way, and that's very important in a campaign. Nobody actually at this point likes to be a front runner. Recent polls in Iowa that were, I think, pretty authoritative polls have shown that he has gained a lead over George Bush. I really do believe it's between the two of them, and I have been pretty confident all along that Bob Dole was going to be the Republican nominee.
On the Bork nomination, is there anything unsettling about it to you, and have you decided how you're going to vote?
Yes, I have said that unless there would be something occur in testimony in the hearings that has not been brought out before or has not been anticipated in any way, that would be troubling, I intend to support Robert Bork. Some of his writings and statements regarding Supreme Court decisions, his analysis of some cases, are certainly not ones I would agree with. To a certain extent, I would find troubling, particularly in his views on majority and minority standing in this country and the role of majority and minority. On the other hand, he has a judicial temperament, and I don't mean temperament, a judicial mind that I think is beyond reproach. And I simply have always believed that we need to attract the best legal minds to our court system, and particularly to the high court. And for that reason, we'll support. If I could just elaborate a bit on that, which maybe I'll get in a question at the lecture, which I anticipate perhaps, but I think from a standpoint of the legislature's legislative responsibility and the legislative branch of government, we too often have shirked our responsibility by, again, drafting legislation in a way that doesn't leave it so ambiguous that the Supreme Court ends up being the interpreter, being the legislator to a certain extent. And I think as far as a more restrictive approach of the court, I couldn't quarrel with when we have, on the legislative side, left the agenda so open because we've not wanted to make the tough decisions, that I think we've asked for some of the ambiguity that exists and for the Supreme Court's more activist role that it's had to undertake.
We have time for one more question.
Senator, you proposed legislation dealing with airlines, certain consumer regulations and so forth. The Department of Transportation has adopted part of that. Is that going to go far enough? How do you feel?
Well, I think that Secretary Dole has promulgated regulations now, which certainly answers a major share of the legislation that actually we've passed in the Senate Commerce Committee and has not gone to the Senate floor yet. My guess is that most of us will go ahead and probably try to take up the legislation on the Senate floor and pass it. I'm pleased that she took the action that she did. I think that we've already seen some, I believe, good results stemming over the last 5 or 6 months of mounting criticism. And the airlines finally have become, I think, more sensitive to the concerns that exist, not regarding safety so much as service. Safety has to be kept separate from just service in the lost luggage complaints and misconnections and delays and so forth. Safety, we must be ever vigilant, and I don't know that we can just answer that with legislation. Even just greater numbers of air traffic controllers, unless they're well trained, unless we're sensitive to the peak time demands and can help spread those out, help improve the morale of the workplace in the towers, we still have some real problems. So I think those continue to exist. But I think from the consumer standpoint and from some of the sloppiness of the operation of the airlines, there's already been some improvement.
Do you feel as safe flying home today or to Washington today as you did a couple of years ago?
Yes, it isn't accomplished quite as easily, but thank you very much. I certainly appreciate. There have been such illustrious lecturers here. I really feel a little uncomfortable almost coming on more as a thank you.
We have copies of Alf Landon's Landon lecture in 1966. If any of you are copies.
Reinhardt and his wife, Linda. Well, as you probably know, Nancy has 4 children, John, Richard, Linda, and Bill, and I'm happy to say they all graduated from Kansas State University. Let's give them a big hand. And I believe that John is here this morning. He's a graduate from the College of Arts and Sciences. John, could you please stand up? There he is right there. Let's give him a big hand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is indeed a very special day, not only in the life of the Landon family, but in the life of Kansas State University. Alf Landon, as you know, is a great statesman, and we were just reminded of this the other day. And certainly the most honored elder citizen of the Republican Party in the United States of America. He's also been a long-time dear friend of Kansas State University. Alf himself and former President James McCain originated the Landon Lecture Series in 1966. Alf gave the inaugural lecture on December 13, 1966. The Landon Lecture Series is Kansas State University's way of commemorating Alf Landon's enormous contributions to the public life of Kansas and America. Since 1966, 75 nationally known figures have come to the Landon Lecture platform to honor Alf Landon and to give their views on the pressing political and economic questions of the day. This is a very special occasion for me and for Kansas State. Today, Alf Landon's daughter, U.S. Senator Nancy Landon Kassebaum, will be the 76th Landon Lecturer on Public Issues. Nancy, we are thrilled and honored to have you here today. But for a formal introduction, I now call upon our student body president, Kent Bradley, who worked for you this summer and did such a nice job, who will introduce you. Kent?
Thank you, Dr. Weefold, for your warm introduction and for this opportunity to introduce one of the most respected senators in our nation's capital. having worked in Washington, D.C. this summer for the senator, and having had the opportunity to interact with other senators, their staffs, and lobbyists in the nation's capital, I can truly make this statement with a great deal of confidence. Our speaker received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Kansas in Political Science and her Master's from Michigan University in Diplomatic History. From her only previous elected position, that of the Mays, Kansas School Board, she went on to be elected to the United States Senate in 1978 and was later re-elected in 1984. In the Senate, her committee assignments include the Budget Committee, Foreign Relations, the Senate Select Committee on Ethics, and the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, of which she is the former chair of the Aviation Subcommittee. The daughter of Theo Cobb Landon and Governor Alfred M. Landon, ladies and gentlemen, I present the 76th Landon Lecture, the Honorable Senator Nancy Landon Kassebaum.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. President Weefall, distinguished guests on the platform, and friends. It's a real advantage being a lecturer at Kansas State University when you're the mother of 4 alumni. I would first just like to make a comment about the Landon patrons, because when the program was started in 1966, it was the support of the patrons, many of whom are here, who started in 1966 and 1967, and others who have come because it has grown significantly, and lent support to the program as well as the faculty and students of Kansas State University. I think it has been a unique opportunity through those years to hear a wide diversity of speakers speaking on the issues of the time. And for me, it's a great honor and pleasure to be invited to be a Landon lecturer today. We have always stipulated that it would not be a Kansan who would be invited to speak as a Landon lecturer. But we broke the barrier with Bob Dole, who is Majority Leader, certainly gave a very distinguished lecture. And then, as I have said to Professor Reagan, it was hard to find someone who would stand in for President Reagan. And so I was available. But it was a wonderful opportunity to speak on Dad's birthday, because living for 100 years is a remarkable achievement. It's happening more frequently today as lives are lived longer. But I think what has been particularly enjoyable for Dad and the family on this occasion have been the cards and the comments that he has received from around the country. Some wonderful observations. One came the other day from a man, I think in New Jersey, who said he remembered the election in '36 well because he was 1 year old and he had swallowed a Landon Knox campaign button. And another one came the other day from a man who had grown up in Independence, Kansas, where Dad moved when he started Kansas University. The family moved, he and his father. And he said he remembered Dad in 1912 driving President Taft in a parade in Independence, Kansas. So it does cover a wide spectrum of our history and involvement. And I think the reminiscence of people remembering, either when they were very small or when they were older, those years. And it's all more remarkable, I guess, when one considers that it's just in 8 days. In 8 days, we will celebrate our Constitution. 200 years in the anniversary of the signing of our Constitution. And my father's life covers half of that time. The past century has seen vast change, even profound upheaval, that reordered the world's political, economic, and military power. Consider just a few of the milestones. In 1914, my father was 27 years old,
and had recently entered the oil business in Kansas when the First World War broke out in Europe. In 4 years' time, the old empires of Europe were washed away, and with the revolution of 1917, the new ideology of Marxism had attained a foothold in Russia. I would note in passing that it was only in 1920 that women won the right to vote. Dad was 33 at that time, and I've never heard him really offer a comment. And as you know, he's never been timid about offering comments on what he thought about that. Of course, he'd say it's just fine today. In 1932, at the age of 45, my father was elected governor of Kansas, and 4 years later, he was the Republican nominee for president. In those years, the Great Depression was sweeping across the country, and the effort to fight it dramatically increased the power and the presence of the federal government in all of our lives. In Europe, those years produced the chilling spread of another ideology, Adolf Hitler's National Socialism. When my father was 54 years old, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor in 1941 and forced the United States into the Second World War. That war completed the power shift that had begun in 1914 and produced the essential outline of the world we know today, two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. In the space of a few years, both superpowers were armed with a power that no one before had ever imagined. Nuclear weapons capable of leveling whole cities in one horrendous moment. Without doubt, the atomic bomb is the most frightening technological achievement in the history of mankind. But in fact, it is but one part of the enormous and bewildering advance of technology that has occurred during my father's lifetime. Dad was 16 years old when Orville Wright shot down a wooden ramp near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, and lifted his airplane, a biplane, into the air for 12 seconds, which was a journey that began the age of flight. Shortly before my father's 82nd birthday, Neil Armstrong placed his foot on the moon. When my father was a boy, a car trip was a great adventure. The telephone was in its infancy, and television was only a laboratory experiment. Today, anyone in this room could take a jet airplane to the other side of the earth in a matter of hours, place a telephone call to Europe by satellite in a matter of seconds, and watch events as they happen nearly anywhere on the planet on live television. In a real sense, our world has shrunk as the automobile, the airplane, and the telephone, television, computers, and satellites have devoured the old meaning and security of distance. At the same time, life has accelerated, time itself has accelerated. A trip that once took months now takes hours. A government action that once would not have been known to all Americans for many days is now communicated in a moment, the moment it happens. An hour is still an hour, but what can happen now in 1 hour is genuinely awesome. There is a paradox in this, however. While the physical world of time and distance has shrunk dramatically, the horizons of our intellectual world have expanded by leaps and bounds, even in day-to-day concerns. It often seems that the only real limit on our inquiries is our imagination. Even that is being stretched by work in physics on the basic of nature, of matter, and in genetics, where we are investigating the stuff of life itself. In short, the past century, the time since my father was born, has brought both a drastic shrinkage of time and distance and an explosion of knowledge. I believe this combination has produced another important change. It has changed the way we think about ourselves and about our world. In government and in business, even in our private lives, We have been forced to adapt to a world where the pace already is fast and seems to be accelerating constantly. The result, increasingly, is that short-term demands displace long-term concerns. As a society, we seem to move from crisis to crisis. This is the way we have dealt with serious problems ranging from what used to be called the energy crisis, to the budget deficit, to drug abuse, to the homeless. Clearly, in an age of rapid change, many changes are made purely for the sake of change. The pressure to do something becomes more important than the question of what should be done. The need for general activity overrides the need for specific action. I spoke earlier of the paradox of a physical world that has grown smaller and closer together, while our intellectual world has expanded beyond all bounds. A second paradox of our time is that our knowledge has expanded, our perspective and understanding have narrowed. Faced with a bewildering array of actions and reactions, we frequently find it difficult, if not impossible, to discern what is truly important. Which, if any, of the many changes occurring around us are fundamental and which are superficial? Answering that question places new and increased demands on each of us as citizens of a democracy, which is itself but part of a wider world of many nation states. Certainly we must each focus on the needs and demands of our own lives, but we also must work constantly to build and maintain a broader perspective on our world. I believe the union of personal goals and ambitions with an awareness of public needs and concerns, in other words, to be an enlightened citizen, is the essential glue of democracy. I also believe that living such a life is one of my father's great personal achievements. In the 100 years since he was born, the world has literally remade itself. Despite all of the change he has witnessed, or perhaps because of it, he developed a knack for combining a keen awareness of current events with a deeper appreciation for the underlying flow of history. In preparing for this lecture, I reread the first Landon lecture given in December of 1966. I was struck not only by his specific observations, but by what he saw as the flow of events. I would like just briefly to review some of his thoughts from more than 20 years ago. First, he spoke of the crucial importance of the new nationalism. As nations throughout the Third World sought independence and self-determination, he predicted that this movement would create great difficulties for the superpowers because it would challenge the authority of both. In the years since that warning was sounded, America has fought and lost a major war in Southeast Asia, where nationalism proved to be an irresistible force. Dictators friendly to us have been overthrown in Iran, Nicaragua, and the Philippines, and others have been challenged in South Korea and Chile. In the cases of the Philippines and Korea, it is instructive to note that our role has been far more positive and so far more productive than it was in all the others. Our ability to be a positive force for change in Central America now is being tested. While that issue is far from settled, I am encouraged that leaders of the region have taken the first step, tenuous as it may be, toward a comprehensive peace plan. I believe it is essential that we support that effort. The new nationalism has posed similar challenges for the Soviets. Since my father spoke here, the Soviet Union has been forced to crush a rebellion in Czechoslovakia, has seen its advisors evicted from a half-dozen African nations, including Egypt, has faced serious upheaval in Poland, and is still fighting what seems to be an endless war to maintain its client regime in Afghanistan. In his lecture, Dad focused on a couple of other key issues. He called for normalizing relations with Communist China, a step we finally took 6 years later. He also sounded a note of deep alarm regarding the results of an earlier conference in Manila on the conflict in Vietnam, and I would like to quote just a few words from that. One result of the Manila conference was the dramatic pronouncement by our president that the United States is a major Asian power and is assuming guardianship in its name over all of Asia. This appears to be an assertion of national responsibility of appalling proportions. Vietnam and the opening of China are, of course, now history. It is a history we must all understand and appreciate as we focus our attention on the events unfolding around us today. With that in mind, I would like to turn to what I believe to be two of the central challenges that face our nation as we move toward the 21st century, just 13 years from now. One of those challenges is our relationship with the Soviet Union as it attempts to achieve a watershed change in its economy. The other is the challenge that we face in adjusting our own economy to a rapidly changing world. I believe one of the most important developments of our time has been the sporadic effort in the Soviet Union and China to begin internal reforms of the Marxist economic system. These efforts have their roots in the early 1960s, when Khrushchev and Deng Xiaoping began to experiment with various reforms. What was clear to both leaders then was that the Marxist theory was not producing its intended results in the real world. My father referred to the importance of these tentative efforts in his lecture. What he did not foresee, and what in fact no one could have foreseen, and we should not overlook today, is that both reform efforts met with intense resistance and were derailed for nearly 20 years. Now both of these reform efforts have been revived with even greater force after Deng returned to power in the mid-1970s and Mikhail Gorbachev attained control in the Soviet Union. The success or failure of these renewed efforts, particularly in the Soviet Union, will have profound and far-reaching effects on the United States and all of the West. Part of the problem. However, the real difficulty lies much deeper and is directly connected to fundamental flaws in the Marxist system. Marxism, at least as it was adopted in the Soviet Union and Communist China, deliberately rejects the idea of diffused power. Instead, it focuses all power, political, economic, military, and judicial, in the hands of a small elite who direct all activity from the top down. To achieve genuine and lasting economic progress, Gorbachev eventually must find ways to make basic changes in the Soviet system. He must provide Soviet workers and factory managers not only more economic choices, but more of the political power that necessarily accompanies such choices. This is an enormous undertaking, and it involves severe risks for the Soviets generally, and certainly for Gorbachev personally. But in doing nothing, that is not an option. If Gorbachev's reforms fail this time, the Soviet Union will fall further and further behind the West in the decades ahead. Its situation will become increasingly desperate, and its internal tensions could become unbearable. If, on the other hand, Gorbachev achieves more than marginal progress, he could produce a genuinely stronger and more vibrant Soviet Union that would pose a whole new kind of challenge to the West. That challenge would not only be the familiar military one, but would involve economic competition as well, which is now largely absent from our relationship, and a political credibility that Marxism has now lost in much of the world. Clearly, we Americans are more than mere interested observers of the ongoing process. The key question for us is whether the Soviets now are genuinely willing to end 70 years of military and political expansionism in order to expand their own internal economy. I have no crystal ball to provide an answer to that question, but I believe we must take the Soviets at their word and seek to build an era of active cooperation between the superpowers. In saying this, I am not suggesting that we accept Soviet statements and promises at face value. I am saying that we must be willing to test the Soviets' words in ways that clearly serve our national interests as well as theirs. I hope we soon will take a small step in this direction by signing a new arms control agreement with the Soviets to eliminate all short and medium-range nuclear missiles. This will have the obvious and important benefit of reducing military tensions. It also could be the first step toward an improved and perhaps markedly different relationship. Beyond this step, I believe we must, and I think this is very important, be more creative and more thoughtful about managing our end of the superpower equation. And we must constantly seek reciprocity from the Soviets. Mikhail Gorbachev already has demonstrated that he can provide a more modern and more vigorous leadership for the Soviet Union. We must not casually dismiss the possibility that he also could produce a more modern and vigorous Soviet Union. This possibility is all the more important in light of the second challenge that I would like to discuss. That is the challenge we face in making our own internal and international economic adjustments to the changing world of the 1980s. Recently, we have seen a series of news stories about how we may be witnessing the end of the so-called American century. I believe such reports are certainly of our natural demise or premature, but no one can deny that there's a kernel of truth at the heart of such reports. Here are a few sobering facts. Last year, the United States ran a trade deficit of $166 billion, and we became the world's largest debtor nation. We now owe more than $200 billion to foreign nations, banks, and individuals. Our federal budget deficit last year was more than $200 billion, and our total national debt has now topped $2 trillion, more than doubling in the past 6 years. In short, we are borrowing billions of dollars to buy consumer items while foreign investors are buying our bonds and our capital assets. The result assures a continuing flow of interest payments, dividends, and profits out of the United States to investors overseas for many years to come. While the raw numbers are large, at this point they are not unmanageable. We are a very rich nation, and we have an enormous economy, so we can afford to borrow some from abroad. What we cannot afford, however, is to continue the current trends indefinitely. Our dependence on foreign oil brought the oil shocks of the 1970s. Our dependence now on foreign credit could just as easily bring the credit shocks of the 1980s and 90s. As with all great national dilemmas, Congress has been wrestling with this problem for months, in fact, for years. At least I can remember the 9 years I've been on the Budget Committee. Now the House and Senate have each produced a massive trade bill that purports to address the issue. A final compromise is expected to be reached and sent to the President sometime this fall. I don't want to prejudge the final result, and it's hard to say what it will be, but I am concerned that so far, much of the legislation and nearly all of the rhetoric is distinctly protectionist. Many members of Congress seem to find it easier to blame foreigners for our borrowing and buying habits than to deal with the underlying problems in our own economy. In part, this reflects our national frustration with the turn of events. After all, we literally rebuilt Japan and Western Europe after World War II and gave them the tools that they now use to compete against us. While this was an act of genuine generosity, we forget that it also was based on our own enlightened self-interest. We resurrected our defeated enemies in order to make them our new allies against the threat of communism. We not only succeeded in military and political terms, but we created the longest and largest economic boom in human history, with enormous benefits for the United States over the past 40 years. This is not to say that we should not expect more from our trade partners and allies. They, like us, have engaged in unfair trade practices that must be corrected. I believe we also must expect them to carry more of the burden of mutual defense, assume more responsibility for stimulating world economic growth, and provide more of the investment necessary to open markets for the next century in Latin America and Africa. However, all of these expectations must be cast in the light and context of genuine partnership. We cannot dictate terms to those we have made our equals, and it is counterproductive to even try. Instead, we must educate and persuade. As the leader of the free world, we must demonstrate true leadership, not merely assume it as our birthright. We can and must begin that task right here at home by putting our own economic house in order, by dealing seriously with the enormous problem of our federal deficit. When Dad ran for president in 1936, he was known as the great budget balancer. He never really particularly, in fact, there's an old Sunflower campaign slogan or car emblem in the basement in the folks' collection that says "Balanced Budget 1936," and I had suggested he might give it to President Reagan, but he never really particularly liked that title, in part because I believe that he thought it was misunderstood by many people. Dad has never believed that balancing the budget was by itself, and neither do I, a magic solution to all of our problems. The true importance of a balanced budget is not in matching numbers on a balance sheet. It is instead demonstrating the control and discipline necessary to match public commitments with public resources. Balancing the federal budget is not a question of accounting. It is a question of politics, of having the will and the courage to make some tough decisions. Our ability to muster that will and courage has occurred only once in the past 20 years and should be a warning sign to all of us. A continuing failure to do so will produce inevitable changes over which we will have no control. The two challenges that I have discussed, the U.S.-Soviet relations and our own economic disorder, will reach important turning points in the year ahead. An arms control agreement could be signed this fall or winter, and Congress will make decisions on the trade bill and the federal budget. The two most important events, however, are likely to come next June. when the Soviet Communist Party convenes a national conference that could decisively affect Gorbachev's internal power to make reforms, and next November when we elect a new president. Whatever the coming year brings, we can have no illusions that the current state of U.S.-Soviet relations either will be maintained indefinitely or improved automatically. Neither can we blithely assume that we will always be first among equals in the West and that our future is guaranteed by past success. Just as the world of my father's boyhood has changed beyond recognition, so the flow of events will carry us forward into the future. That is the challenge of change, a challenge my father always was confident that the American people could meet. Happy birthday, Dad.
Nancy, I think your dad is very proud of you, especially today and this morning. That was an excellent lecture. We're so honored to have Nancy Kassebaum here at Kansas State University today. She's doing a first-rate job as a U.S. Senator, and it's just... Well, Nancy has agreed to answer some questions here today, and for those of you who would like to ask questions, I wish you would proceed to the mics on your right or your left, and so I would like to call the senator back to the podium.
Which side do I start on first? Or are there any questions?
Good morning, Senator. I have a question. First of all, I was very glad to hear of your support for the Central American Peace Plan. I would like you to comment on your view of the Reagan administration's support for that plan in light of the following facts. Since President Oscar Arias of Costa Rica has taken the initiative in seeking a negotiated peace in Central America, the United States has raised tariffs on Costa Rican products, has refused to intercede on Costa Rica's behalf in its negotiations with private banks about its debt, and it has failed to even appoint an ambassador to the country now for about 7 months, and has not dispersed about $120 million in foreign aid that has been budgeted for about 6 months now. Don't you think these are signs that the administration really isn't all that happy about Mr. Arias's attempt to achieve a negotiated settlement in Central America?
No, I really don't. And some of those questions you can address to President Arias when he's here in a couple of weeks as the Landon lecture. But I would say that in many ways I think the administration, which was caught off guard by all 5 of the presidents signing the Arias plan, has responded very well. I think President Reagan has lent support to the effort, saying that it does have some problems. The administration itself, within itself, is somewhat divided on how to be supportive and carry through. As I said, I think there are some problems with the Arias plan, but it's very important for us at this point to be supportive. If we don't help nurture the process, it will fail. And if it fails, we're going to be far worse off, not only regarding Nicaragua, but El Salvador in particular as well, than we have ever been, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years. And the situation will deteriorate rapidly in Central America as a whole. But there are just enormous problems in that area, and one of them being a responsibility that I believe we have towards the Contras. We helped create that force, and the refugees, besides, have numbers ranging anywhere from 10 to 20 to 25,000 people, combining refugees and Contras and so forth. We have to, I think, guarantee and make sure there are guarantees of amnesty and protection and assimilation and support for those people. I think we have some responsibility there. So there are just some enormous challenges that are posed in Nicaragua and Honduras, El Salvador and Costa Rica and Guatemala. But I think that it's possible. But certainly President Ortega has to show some goodwill in his support of this effort as well. It's not a one-sided venture.
Thank you.
Is there anyone that's on? I can't see. Over here? Okay.
Senator Kassebaum, in preparation for your visit here, I too read some of your father's writings, a book that he wrote 50 years ago, when I guess he would have been 50, if my math is right. And what struck me in that book that he wrote was a section on control of information. Particularly struck me because it was a common theme in that writing with a letter that you wrote me last year about administration policies and regarding the control of information. Your father wrote that one of the greatest dangers to our democracy is not censorship of the press, which of course we don't have, but the suppression of information at its source. In the letter you wrote me last year, you were greatly disturbed, you said, about the administration's attempt to control information and, to quote you, stifle dissent. This was prior to the Iran-Contra hearings. And I'm wondering, after hearing all the Iran-Contra hearings, it seems to me that the litany we had from the administration witnesses in those hearings was that the Congress, and presumably yourself, was vacillating, had an on-again, off-again policy, and generally it seemed to me that the characterization of your political activity in debating a dubious cause, that is the Contras, was assassinated, really, was characterized as something stupid, uninformed, and irresponsible. I was wondering if you would respond to this kind of litany of charges of the Congress, including yourself, being irresponsible in debating Contra support in the way you have.
Well, there's sort of two parts to that maybe, but in responding to Congress, we frequently are, I think, on again and off again, and ambiguity seems to be one of our modes of operation. I think regarding Central America policy, and particularly Contra efforts in Nicaragua, we have had a difficult time. Some, like myself, believed it was starting down the wrong path to be supportive and initiate a Contra effort, even though clearly the Sandinista government was not living up to its promises of reform of during the time of the revolution. How one addressed that, we have struggled with in Congress. And we have been on again, off again. Myself, in the last Contra vote, believed we should provide the additional $40 million in Contra aid because it came at a time fulfilling the rest of the money that we had approved in the previous year that I thought provided leverage for the Sandinistas government to get to the peace table and negotiate. There are many who don't believe that it's even possible to negotiate with the Sandinistas. And I'm sure there are many here today who would think that isn't possible. Others who believe that the Sandinistas could do no wrong. And we seem to polarize ourselves in such emotional ways where we can't argue back and forth different circumstances and different relationships that I think do determine how we vote. And part of our own anguish, I think, reflects our constituency.
Down on the 33-yard line.
We're a very open country, and we do debate, and we can picket, and we can discuss and cuss each other in a very open way. And in fact, there are very few state secrets on the whole that are that for very long. It can be enormously frustrating, and I think particularly for foreigners to understand how we are such an open government in many ways. But we wouldn't have it any other way. And out of all of that comes, I think, hopefully a policy that we can continue to mold. Unfortunately, as I said in my remarks, we want results in 24 hours, and we seldom will stick with anything long enough to really bring it to lasting fruition. And I think in Central America we have to be willing to provide support so the economies can stabilize, so the political institutions there can stabilize. You cannot build a democracy if you don't have a functioning judicial system, if you don't have functioning institutional programs on which you can build governmental institutions. And that's just what doesn't exist, and it takes time to make that work. One more question.
With the Bork hearings beginning soon, I'd like to hear your comments about that and what the impact will be if he gets confirmed to the nation as a whole.
Thank you. I was wondering after seeing the pickets if I was going to get a question. I have said that I will be supporting Judge Bork's nomination unless there should be something coming, something that should come out from the hearing that would prove to be exceptionally troubling. I haven't heard anything at this point. There are many of Judge Bork's writings regarding Supreme Court decisions with which I would disagree. But I have tremendous respect for his intellectual integrity. I have tremendous respect for his understanding of the law and of the Constitution. And I have to believe that he will bring that intellect to bear in an informed and imbalanced way on the court. One of the greatest concerns I have is perhaps his views on the role of the majority and the minority in this country. And I hope as we hear him articulate these views, it will be instructive to all of us. But I would just like to add a larger concern in many ways that I think we in Congress have allowed to happen, and that is that from a legislative standpoint, we have not been precise enough in the statutes that we pass. We have been very ambiguous, again, in leaving large loopholes that have then simply meant that the court had to interpret. The court had to assume the difficult decisions which we, I think, have had and should have a legislative responsibility to assume. And as a result, we have had a court that over the years has become more of an activist court than I think it should be. On the other hand, it became so by default. Thank you. Thank you.
Great job. Well, Vice President George Bush has said this, that the Landon Lecture Series represent the most distinguished lecture series in America. Well, we owe Alf Landon a lot. We love Alf Landon in Kansas, and I think it's safe to say, given this great crowd here today, that everybody in Kansas loves Nancy Kassebaum. Let's give her another real big hand. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.